Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
President Trump has warned Russia to get ready for missile strikes against Syria in response to an alleged chemical attack near Damascus at the weekend. Russia has been urging Washington not to take military action, with senior figures threatening to meet any U.S. strikes with a response. Theresa May says the continued use of chemical weapons cannot go unchallenged, and Britain is working with its closest allies on what action to take. The World Health Organization says 500 people in the town of Douma have shown symptoms consistent with exposure to toxic chemicals. Our Middle East editor Jeremy Bowen has more.
Syrians who've survived the last days of the Eastern Ghouta enclave are being bussed out of the ruins and into their new lives, which will not be easy. These people's top priorities were food and shelter for their families, and only then their recollections of what they saw.
We lived through very difficult times in the Eastern Ghouta, especially the final 3 days in Douma, when the regime carried out its attacks on civilian neighborhoods and used chlorine gas, which caused suffocation among civilians.
But in Washington, President Trump's morning tweet was particularly incendiary. He told the Russians to get ready for nice, new and smart missiles in Syria, adding they shouldn't be partners with a gas-killing animal. He meant President Assad. In Moscow, President Putin didn't respond publicly anyway, and he didn't echo earlier, more threatening comments from his diplomats.
The situation in the world is becoming more and more chaotic. Nonetheless, we hope all the same that good sense will in the end prevail.
With so much hardship in Syria, the Russians also said providing aid should be the priority, not the West versus the Assad regime.
All the indications are that the Syrian regime was responsible, and we will be working with our closest allies on how we can ensure that those who are responsible are held to account, and how we can prevent and deter the humanitarian catastrophe that comes from the use of chemical weapons in the future.
The war of words over the response to the attack in Douma has heated up. Donald Trump is tweeting more fiercely than ever. We should take his threat seriously because he's the President of the United States and he's angry about an alleged conspiracy against him at home. But Britain's Theresa May and the French President Emmanuel Macron won't want to be part of an operation driven by Mr. Trump's anger. And will the US and its allies be able to bomb with potentially 2 sets of international investigators in Syria? Chemical weapons inspectors want to visit the site of the attack, and so does the World Health Organization.
According to our health partners, more than 500 people presented themselves last Saturday to health facilities with symptoms that are consistent to symptoms of exposure to toxic chemicals.
A generation of Syrians knows only war. Western leaders need to work out whether bombing will make the lives of Syrian civilians better or worse. Using force in as complicated a place as Syria was never going to be easy or clean. Jeremy Bowen, BBC News.
Well, in a moment, we'll get the latest from Steve Rosenberg in Moscow and John Pienaar at Westminster. But first, let's go to the White House, and John Sopel is there. John, uncompromising words from President Trump despite threats of a Russian response.
Yeah, and the language seems to be getting hotter and hotter. I don't know whether the Russians hoped that by saying what they did, it would give the president pause for thought. It seems to have given him cause to escalate. And to be honest, some of the language we've heard on both sides sounds more like the trash talking you get from 2 heavyweight boxers at the weigh-in before they get into the ring to fight. And that's brought criticism for Donald Trump as well from one of his allies in the Senate, saying promising war by tweet insults not only the Constitution but every soldier who puts their life on the line. What we can seem to glean is that the Americans seem to be planning for a more prolonged operation than happened a year ago, when it was just a single strike on one Syrian airfield. But does it go beyond Syrian air defences to target wider regime targets? Those are the questions that we still don't know. And then there are the huge strategic questions. What is American policy towards Syria? Is it for regime change? Is it for further involvement? Is it for pulling out? On those questions, we're none the wiser.
Well, tonight the Kremlin made it clear we do not take part in Twitter diplomacy. It is important, the Kremlin said, not to do anything that would harm an already fragile situation. But I think there are two main messages coming from Moscow. The first message is that there was no chemical weapons attack by the Syrian government. That reports of such an attack, says Moscow, are a provocation and a fabrication by the Syrian rebels. The second message is a warning to Donald Trump, to America and to the West, a warning printed in the Russian government newspaper this morning. And it went like this, that Russia reserves the right to shoot down planes and to sink ships which are acting aggressively in Syria. In other words, America, keep your nice new smart missiles to yourself. Now, of course, neither Moscow nor Washington wants the Syrian war to spiral into a Russia-America war. But the problem is, when you have this surfeit of saber-rattling and rhetoric, and a complete deficit of trust, that is a dangerous combination.
There's no real doubt tonight that Theresa May wants Britain to be involved in any military action. She as good as said so today when she spoke of the need to prevent and deter another attack. And in government, this issue is seen also as being tied up with British influence and punching power in the world. It is also difficult for Theresa May to keep up, let alone keep in step with Donald Trump. His tweets today landed with quite a thud in Whitehall. It is also difficult and delicate to handle Parliament. Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour leader, has said today that Parliament should always be involved in any decision to take military action. But I'm hearing tonight from very well-placed senior sources that Theresa May now see consulting Parliament before action as the kind of thing she simply cannot afford to do, a luxury she can't afford. She sees it as urgent to take action to prevent another attack. And although she wouldn't put it this way, she is, I'm told, quite reluctant to ask President Trump to hold off while she consults at Westminster. This would be difficult for Theresa May at the best of times. She's a cautious leader, and these are far from being the best of times.
OK, John, thank you for that. John Pienaar there at Westminster, Steve Rosenberg in Moscow, and to you, John Sopel, at the White House. Thank you.
Get ready, Russia. The missiles are coming. President Trump has warned as he pledged to launch an attack over the suspected chemical weapons attack in Syria. Describing President Assad as a gas-killing animal who kills his people and enjoys it, Moscow has already upped the ante, declaring it will send troops to Syria, to the Syrian town of Douma, to ensure its security, although the Kremlin said it refused to engage in Twitter diplomacy. Our international editor, Lindsay Hilsum, has this report, and there are distressing images in it.
Some presidents have ornate palaces to show the world the greatness of their nation. President Putin was accepting credentials from diplomats today and trying to sound statesmanlike.
The state of things in the world can only give rise to concern. The situation in the world is getting more chaotic. Nevertheless, we hope that common sense will prevail.
Other presidents turn to Twitter. Russia vows to shoot down any and all missiles fired at Syria, tweeted President Trump. Get ready, Russia, because they will be coming nice and new and smart. You shouldn't be partners with a gas-killing animal who kills his people and enjoys it. The tweet came after a Russian diplomat said that Russian forces would not only shoot down American missiles, but also target their launch pads. The US Defense Secretary said they were still assessing the intelligence about the apparent chemical weapons attack on a rebel-held suburb of Damascus at the weekend.
We stand ready to provide military options if they're appropriate, as the President determined.
Right, now somebody's got to remind me.
The Prime Minister, in Birmingham to announce renovations to a stadium, was trying to throw a beanbag. She wasn't to be drawn on whether British forces would be launching anything more lethal in the days to come.
All the indications are that this was the responsibility of the Syrian regime, and we will now work with our closest allies, to see how we can ensure those responsible are held to account and how we can prevent and deter the humanitarian catastrophe that is the use of chemical weapons in the future, because the continued use of chemical weapons cannot go unchallenged.
Syrian forces, backed by Russians, retook the suburb of Douma after the apparent chemical attack. They visited one of the houses which was reportedly hit, as well as the hospital.
We haven't seen any indications of any victims of sarin or any other chemical weapon. When we visited the patients, they had no symptoms of chlorine or sarin.
These children, the Russians have suggested, are actors. It was all faked. The World Health Organization begs to differ.
We have received reports from our health partners about more than 500 people who presented themselves to health facilities on Saturday with symptoms that are consistent with symptoms of exposure to highly toxic chemicals.
The people of Douma fled and the rebels who controlled the suburbs surrendered. If the chemical weapon attack was faked, it was strangely effective in helping the government regain territory. But it may yet bring America and its allies further into the war in Syria.
Lindsay Hilsum reporting. Well, we're joined now by Dr. Amanda Sloat, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. She previously worked for the State Department under President Obama on European and Middle Eastern affairs. Dr. Sloat, what would the aim of these strikes that Mr. Trump seems pretty certain are going to occur?
Presumably they're going to be punitive strikes to punish what looks like the use by the Assad regime of chemical weapons. So if they are in keeping with the strikes that were done a year ago, they'll be targeting elements of the Air Force and presumably also runways that were used to conduct these strikes.
Does he have the capacity to wipe out the Air Force without Russian collateral?
The question is going to be how big the strikes are going to be. Are they going to be small, measured, punitive strikes targeted specifically at the CW use, or does he broaden this out to a longer-term, bigger action that is seeking to undermine the military capabilities of the regime longer term?
In such a tiny theatre of war, the danger of something going wrong and Russia and America clashing. I mean, for example, shooting down American missiles by Russian artillery.
You're absolutely right. The battle space in Syria is incredibly congested. We've already seen the Turks shooting down a Russian plane for violating its airspace. We have the potential for conflict between U.S. and Turkish-backed forces as part of the Turkish military operation there. And as you said, there is a real risk now of conflict between U.S. and Russian forces if Russia ends up trying to intercept or retaliate for U.S. military action against the regime.
And is there a firm legal basis for this, for example, under United Nations tutelage?
That's an excellent question. It was something that really preoccupied President Obama when he chose not to take strikes in 2013, and it was a discussion that came up a year ago. There's two issues here. One is the domestic legal basis, and what Trump said last time was he did this under the Article 2 constitutional provisions as commander-in-chief, but it still raises questions about what the international legal basis is, since you don't have UN backing for this, and there's dubious support given to the provision for humanitarian intervention.
So just to sort of return to the idea of American-Russian collateral, what if the Russians decide to shoot down an American missile? What happens?
Well, I guess there's a difference between them going after a missile and them going after U.S. forces on the ground. That's the important thing to remember as well, is we have 2,000 U.S. forces that are currently on the ground in Syria in very close proximity to where Russians have been operating in the northwest of the country. So we're potentially going to be seeing a significant military escalation in U.S. involvement in Syria, which is coming at the same time that we have Trump saying he wants to pull U.S. troops out as quickly as possible. If he does end up pulling U.S. troops out, it potentially lessens the potential for direct conflict on the ground. But as of now, we have American forces on the ground in Syria.
When I was at college, I used to be told about the element of surprise, but Mr. Trump seems to be flaunting what he's going to do.
Which is particularly surprising, given that he criticized President Obama in 2013 for doing the exact same thing and saying that you should maintain the element of surprise and you should not be telling your enemy when you're looking to attack. What's very striking about this is that he is going after both Putin and Assad by name in these tweets, and certainly ramping up rhetorically what it is he's looking to do.
And is there briefly any danger that his own domestic difficulties, special prosecutor, all the rest of it, is fueling his anger and wanting him to get people onto another page?
Well, President Trump has taken action against the Syrian regime in the past for the use of CW. So in military grounds, there is precedence for this within the administration. But what is striking about this is he is now going after Putin by name, as I said, which he has been criticized for in terms of not criticizing Russian interference in the U.S. election.
Amanda Sloat, thank you very much indeed for talking with us.
Here, as we've been hearing, the Prime Minister, Theresa May, has redoubled her condemnation of that suspected gas attack in Syria on Saturday. But she wouldn't be drawn on Donald Trump's bellicose tweets. MPs from across Parliament, though, are demanding that they get the chance to debate any UK-backed military action before it happens, if it happens. Our political correspondent, Michael Crick, is in Westminster. Michael, what are the ruminations there?
Well, Downing Street emphasising today that there has been a significant hardening of Theresa May's position, both in her view that the Assad regime was behind the weekend's attack and in her conviction that Britain should join with America and France in ensuring that there is that the future use of chemical weapons, in her words, cannot go unchallenged. I'm not sure we're thinking of anything quite imminent yet. I think the government needs to get some more of its ducks in a row. And I think certainly before any action was taken by Britain, one would expect, for instance, Mrs May to consult her cabinet colleagues.
What about consulting Parliament, though? Do you think Parliament will get a vote, as many MPs are now demanding, before any military action takes place?
Certainly there are MPs on both sides who say that should happen. Jeremy Corbyn said today that should happen. I think the government's making it clear they're not going to recall Parliament before this weekend. Parliament, of course, is back on Monday and could debate and vote on it then. And I think in the climate post-Salisbury, actually, the arithmetic would go in the government's favour. I think compared with the vote 5 years ago, where David Cameron embarrassingly lost on a similar vote, I think there would be fewer Tory rebels, more Labour rebels supporting the government. And interestingly today, Vince Cable and his predecessor Tim Farron making it clear that they want a vote, but they probably would support military action.
Michael, thanks very much. Well, on that note, a short time ago, I spoke to the Liberal Democrat leader, Sir Vince Cable, and I started by asking him if his party did indeed support military action.
Well, we believe that there has to be prior approval by Parliament to any military action. There also have to be quite severe conditions set around it, but we don't absolutely rule it out.
What conditions might you be talking about? How limited would you want military action to be? I mean, are you talking about just targeting chemical facilities, for example?
Well, the principle is about upholding international law in respect to the use of chemical weapons. But I stress that the conditions that would have to be attached to it to protect British interests, not just from the kind of collateral damage that might affect Russian interests or Iranian, for example, but with the erratic behaviour of the President of the United States, the conditions would have to be very tight.
What conditions can you put on the President of the United States, though? I mean, you're powerless to do anything about that.
Well, we just have to be very cautious about being drawn into anything with President Trump, whose behaviour, even the comments today, cast serious doubt over his judgment. If
Parliament were to back UK involvement in any military action, you've potentially therefore got the US, the UK, France on one side with other nations too, against Russia, Syria and Iran on the other side. To some people looking at that, that looks like World War III and is a pretty frightening prospect.
It is a very frightening prospect, and of course the whole purpose of establishing conditions would be to try to make sure that that's not happening. The action, if it happened, would be very, very specifically directed at the Assad regime and its chemical weapons installation. I seem to remember that when President Trump did authorize a strike, the Russians were given advance warning so that they were not affected. I guess his tweet today was probably prompted by the same kind of considerations.
Vince Cable, thank you very much.
All the signs are tonight that in the next 24 hours, Britain will commit to a military response to a suspected chemical attack in Syria. The Prime Minister appears to believe chemicals were used and that President Assad's forces were responsible. It's become clear in the past few minutes that there will be an emergency cabinet meeting tomorrow afternoon to decide whether to join action by the United States and France without recalling Parliament. A prospect looking ever more likely after President Trump warned Assad's ally Russia. Get ready, he said on Twitter. The missiles are coming. They're nice, new and smart ones.
In the Oval Office today, the President was signing a bill into law. But it was a tweet 4 hours earlier that has stunned Washington and alarmed his own generals. For Trump both taunted the Russians and gave advance warning of a strike on Syria. He wrote on Twitter, "Russia vows to shoot down any and all missiles fired at Syria. Get ready, Russia, because they will be coming, nice and new and smart. You shouldn't be partners with a gas-killing animal who kills his people and enjoys it." If Moscow decides now to defend Syrian airspace with its own fighter jets and its highly capable air defense systems, then a military clash between the superpowers in the skies above the battlefield looks like a real danger. Russia's ambassador to Lebanon suggested that not only would US missiles be intercepted, but even the sources of the strikes would be targeted, implying retaliation against US ships and submarines. The USS Donald Cook, seen here on an earlier deployment, is one of several American warships in the area. Satellite imagery shows that Russian ships have also left a Syrian port ahead of the likely strikes. The US Defense Secretary was more cryptic today, saying analysis and planning is not yet finished.
We're still assessing the intelligence ourselves and our allies. We're still working on this.
In the last hour, the White House spokesperson has repeatedly refused to say whether the US would target Russian forces in Syria.
We have a number of options, and all of those options are still on the table. All options are on the table. All of those options remain on the table.
But Britain, with its strategic airbase in Cyprus, does appear tonight to be much closer to joining the imminent military action.
We've been working with our allies and partners, and we're rapidly reaching an understanding of what happened on the ground. All the indications are that the Syrian regime was responsible, and we'll be working with our closest allies to consider how we can ensure that those responsible are held to account.
One retired US general said he expects a much bigger attack than last year's strike, when 59 cruise missiles were launched against a single Syrian airbase.
I think it'll be a significant strike, I hope, that goes after the chemical warfare capability of the Syrian armed forces. That means try and destroy their air force. That isn't a one-day mission, though. That would be a multi-day mission. We ought to assume for sure we will end up killing Iranians and probably Russians.
From the suburb that was hit by chemical weapons, newly released video appears to show at least one of the bombs, although it is impossible to verify these pictures. The results of that attack and those weekend images that assailed the conscience of Western leaders may have triggered the greatest test of superpower relations since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Robert Moore, News at 10, Washington.
Well, our political editor, Robert Peston, is here with me in the studio. Robert, what more can you tell us about this cabinet meeting that's been called for tomorrow?
Well, Downing Street sources, as you pointed out, have told me that the cabinet has been summoned for an emergency session tomorrow afternoon to discuss the British response to this chemical attack on Douma. Now, the Prime Minister, I am told, is now convinced that President Assad of Syria was responsible for that attack as a result of intelligence she's received, in part from our allies. The timing of the meeting is very significant because it indicates that she believes that the French and the Americans are poised to launch an airborne attack on Syria, and she feels that Britain has to stand shoulder to shoulder with France and America, I think partly because they stood by us in terms of the retaliation to the poisoning in Salisbury with the expulsion of Russian diplomats. Now, what she is doing is high risk in a number of different ways. If, as seems likely, we see these airborne strikes as soon possibly as tomorrow night, she will be doing something without the authorisation of MPs. Now, Jeremy Corbyn has said today any attack should get the approval of Parliament, and actually there are some Tories who take the same view. So she would, in a sense, be overriding Parliament. It indicates that she is not committing British troops in any kind of conventional way, that this attack will be with smart missiles from a distance, using drones, using the latest technology. She will say this is not the kind of attack that needs to be authorised by Parliament. But, and this is the really important point, we don't know how Russia will retaliate, and the long-term consequences for security could be severe. So she will come under pressure from Parliament still to consult MPs.
OK, Robert, thank you very much indeed. Well, tonight the threat of action appears to have effectively grounded the Syrian Air Force, with apparently not a single bombing raid carried out today. Let's get the latest from both Moscow and Washington. We'll join Robert more in the US capital in a moment, but first to Steve Scott in Moscow. Steve, what's the position of the Kremlin tonight?
Well, there's been reaction, Raggy, from all sides of the Kremlin this evening. President Putin, in a rather understated way, said he recognised how the current global situation was a cause for concern, but he hoped that common sense would prevail. His official spokesman has been a little bit more direct in a clear criticism of President Trump's outburst on social media today. He said Moscow would not be drawn into any Twitter diplomacy. He also said that Russia believed the chemical attack was staged to provoke a response that could only be damaging for the fragile Syrian state at the moment. And then finally from the Foreign Office on the threat of airstrikes, saying that missiles should be targeting terrorists, in other words, Syrian rebels, and not legitimate governments, President Assad's regime. So I think the rhetoric from here is firm but not inflammatory, but you can expect that to change dramatically if or when airstrikes get underway.
All right, Steve in Moscow, thanks very much indeed. Robert, to you in Washington. Could the Americans and Russians, as you were sort of pointing out in your piece, actually really come to blows over this?
Well, I think the risk is very real. It's going to depend on decision-making here in Washington and in Moscow over the next few hours and days. I mean, for example, will the Americans actually try and target and suppress the S-400 air defense system in Syria, which is very clearly manned by Russian personnel? Moscow would regard that as a major provocation. And also, will they try and intercept and down American and potentially British missiles and warplanes? Certainly the foreign policy establishment, if you like, is deeply alarmed by the prospect of escalation. The president's critics alleging that he doesn't have a Syria strategy and he doesn't have a Russia strategy, and that is being brutally exposed at the moment. There is also a real concern that this is in many ways what people feared, the perfect storm, a domestic crisis in the sense of the Mueller investigation closing in on the White House. That is interlocking with a foreign policy crisis that, if it isn't extremely carefully handled, could very easily spiral out of all control.
Robert in Washington, thanks very much indeed.
Relations have been getting bad for a while, but we reached a jaw-dropping moment today. A Russian ambassador arguing that his country would shoot down missiles aimed at Syria and even retaliate against launch sites if there was an attack. Then President Trump retorted on Twitter, "Get ready, Russia, because they'll be coming." Nice and new and smart. It sounded rather like the way social media is said to have amplified gang conflict in London, apparently, contributing to the rise in knife attacks. Except this is Russia and America. It was only back in 2009 that a then new President Obama wanted to press the reset button on the relationship with Russia. Then President Trump promised, "We're going to have a great relationship with Putin and Russia," he said. Well, not quite. All news leads to Russia right now. The Skripals, Facebook and fake news, and above all Syria. And it's Syria which is forcing a choice on the US and its allies on how to deal with Putin and his allies. Mark Urban is with me. Mark, on Syria, where are we this evening?
Well, we had that tweet this morning, get ready Russia, the missiles are on their way, as it were, at Syrian targets, we assume he meant. Now, at the White House press briefing this evening, doubt has been cast. The president is still looking at options. It was implied these might not even include a missile attack. Now, you might say, oh, well, they're trying to reintroduce an element of strategic uncertainty or wrong foot the potential opponents. Or you might say this is just a White House that is all over the place in terms of its messaging.
Now, when it comes, to the Americans and the British as well, timing, what's the horizon we're talking about?
Some people were suggesting this would happen tonight, but now we see some interesting indications from Downing Street. Firstly, that Downing Street appears ready to join in. We don't know exactly by what methods to support a possible military action. that there will be a special cabinet meeting tomorrow, so we don't think that will happen tonight, therefore. And we've got, of course, the White House saying the president is still looking at options. And a report tonight in the Telegraph suggesting that nuclear submarines, British ones, would have to get into place and be there within range by tomorrow evening. American ships are setting sail, heading across the Atlantic, but events, it seems, may not allow them sufficient time to get to the Eastern Med. Instead, it looks tonight like military action with the assets already in place. So what do we think is in position now? There's a couple of warships, including the French Aquitaine and USS Cook, both equipped with cruise missiles. There's another couple of destroyers and perhaps a submarine that could join in firing those. The Americans could also use stealth aircraft like the F-22 and B-2 bomber to add to the mix. And today, several flight refueling tankers moved to the eastern Mediterranean as a possible prelude to that. The British might add support, intelligence gathering and perhaps bombing too from their base in Cyprus. If you want more firepower, that's still a few days' sail away in the shape of the Truman carrier group still out in the Atlantic. What all this suggests is a desire to hurt Syria more than last year's raids, but not so much that the Russians become casualties. So how to make sure of that? Possibly the Russians might even be warned.
President Trump has telegraphed pretty clearly his intentions to do something. But again, Russia might choose in this case to refuse to pull its personnel back and to say, no, we're not going to just let you do this strike in effect. We're going to keep our personnel here, and if you really want to go ahead with this, you'll have to risk going through us. So I think the options for deconfliction depend very much on how much Russia is willing to stand aside.
So what about targeting? Clearly the Americans don't want to touch the major Russian facilities at Tartus naval base and Himamim airfield. The US could prioritise Syrian airfields, like these two near Damascus, one of which is home to helicopters that may have been used to drop chlorine cylinders. Further afield, you have T4 and Sherat, both air bases that have been hit before. Key chemical weapons and regime bases in the Mount Kassun area might also be struck. For the military planners, targeting that does more damage than at Sherat airfield last year, but not so much that Russians are killed at some of these bases is the aim. But having telegraphed their intentions so clearly in advance, they may well find that many of the key Syrian assets have been moved before they strike.
Mark Urban. Well, I'm joined now by the Conservative MP Chris Philp and former US Ambassador to the United Nations, Zalmay Khalilzad. Very good evening to you both. Zalmay, if I may start with you, should there be a punishment for the chemical attack on Saturday?
Well, it has got to be not only punishment, but deterrence, so that these sorts of attacks using chemical weapons do not occur again. And therefore, the challenge is how robust should the strike be, or how protracted should the strikes be, to have the deterrence effect without escalating the situation in which the U.S. get dragged into the Syrian civil war or into a confrontation, a military confrontation with Russia.
Okay, and give us the answer to that. What is the right level of deterrence? What gives you deterrence but without escalation?
Well, that was, I think, the message that the president, I think, meant to send to Vladimir Putin, that we are coming, but we're coming for Syria, and that he was inviting them to stay out of what the U.S. is going to do. I believe that what would be required would be a series of strikes that hurts the regime, Bashar al-Assad, substantially, so that he would calculate that going to use chemical weapons again would be too risky. Right. It will have to be considerably more than what we did a year ago.
Okay, let me put that to Chris Philp. Where are you on the deterrence without escalation?
Well, I agree with the former ambassador's analysis. I think, first of all, my starting point is that an atrocity has been committed, particularly having heard the World Health Organization's views today that their partners on the ground do believe chemical weapons were used that killed 43 people. I think the West does have to act. We can't allow women and children to be murdered with chemical weapons and stand aside and do nothing. But I agree with the ambassador's analysis. We need to be carefully targeted in how we take that action to avoid escalation by pinpointing the Syrian military assets that either manufacture or deliver these agents. By being very precise, I think we can avoid the risk of escalation.
Would you tell the Russians? Because one option is to say to the Russians, look, this is where we're going to strike, so get your planes and people out of the way so you don't get caught in it.
Well, I'm not sure I'd necessarily go that far. If we're striking chemical weapons facilities, and the Russians would be well advised to stay away from those. But the important point to make is this is not about retribution or punishment. It's about two things. It's about degrading the Syrian government's ability to manufacture and deliver these weapons. And secondly, it's about deterrence. And it's very noticeable that after we failed to act in September 2013, there were a period of years when Assad did use chemical weapons, but about a year ago, the Americans took very limited action, and for a period of 12 months, the last 12 months, there were no chemical weapons attacks. So I think this deterrent point is incredibly important.
Right. Mr. Khalilzad, what do the... are you scared of escalation in a bigger Cold War or with hot flashpoints between Russia and the US? Do you think we should be scared of that now? There are really quite a lot of fronts on which there is conflict between these two.
I think that one has to be concerned about the potential for escalation, and therefore one has to go the extra mile to make it clear to Vladimir Putin that the objective of the strikes is degradation and deterrence, as the Member of Parliament said, and that the US does not intend to get involved otherwise in Syria and does not want to challenge the position of Russia in Syria. That puts then the burden on Russia, on Putin. Does he want to risk a conflict with the United States, given what the US message is, that the purpose is deterrence of use of chemical weapons?
Yeah, but I mean, really, the Russians and the Syrians are actually unlikely to actually be deterred, aren't they? Because for the Syrians, this is existential, and the Russians are not going to see it as being a serious strike against them personally. So in the end, it's not going to deter.
I don't know whether the strikes that the US will carry out, if it is focused on deterrence, would be existential. The balance of power in Syria has changed significantly in favor of the regime, and the Russian position is relatively strong, given that it also has the Iranian support there. But I think President Trump has played a game of chicken with Mr. Putin. He has thrown the steering wheel out, saying, we're coming. And now it's up to him to escalate or to stay out. Right. And for staying out, the message is we're not going to change. We're not going to change the situation on the ground dramatically, and we're not going to come after you. So I think there is a way that it could work. But of course, Syria is the most complex, the most complex, and there is a risk that things can get out of control.
Let me just put last one to Chris Philp. It looks like the British are on board for this, and I don't recollect there being a vote of Parliament to sign up to that.
Well, of course, we need to wait and see what decisions both the French, the Americans and the UK government take in the coming hours and the coming days. But this idea about a vote in Parliament, clearly it's desirable that Parliament has a chance to debate this, but sometimes events on the ground move very fast and it simply isn't possible. And this idea that we have a vote before action is a relatively recent one. It happened in 2003 with Iraq and again in 2013 and 15. But historically we haven't had votes. I mean, you know, we declared war on Germany in 1939 without a vote in Parliament. And I think if there is a fast-moving military or diplomatic situation, you wouldn't want to circumscribe the government's ability to manoeuvre by requiring a vote.
I wonder whether you would win the vote, because the Democratic Unionists voted against action in 2013. They hold the balance of power at the moment.
It's true they did, but a number of Conservative MPs, like Andrew Percy, have made clear that although they voted against before, they would potentially vote with now. And quite a few Labour backbenchers, many of whom, of course, did vote for action against Daesh in Syria in December 2015, like Ruth Smith, for example, have indicated they would be open to supporting it. So I wouldn't make any assumptions about the vote.
Chris Philp, thank you very much. And Tazal as well. Well, we've talked about Syria and our response to Russia's involvement there, but let's look inside Russia itself now, because we associate the country with its president. And there's a potentially complicating factor there. There are different factions around President Putin. Much of what happens might just be reflecting the playing out of tensions between them. Gabriel Gatehouse explains in a film that does contain some flashing images.
Kremlinology is back. Russia projects an image of control, the ultimate vertical power structure. But who's really pulling the strings?
The Putin system of power, the so-called power vertical, is much more like a Byzantium court than a system of kind of totalitarian dictatorship where the leader dictates to his subordinates. But rather, Putin has always played the role of a kind of a power broker between the different groupings around the Kremlin that all vowed for power.
When we talk about the Kremlin, what we're really talking about is a patchwork of factions with Putin at its center. One way of dividing the clans is between the powerful security services, known as the Siloviki on the one hand, and a loose grouping of elites on the other, including technocrats and Putin loyalists. Both sides have their own politicians and oligarchs. The system functions thanks to a fragile balance of power. Tensions between the factions can have deadly consequences. The killing of Boris Nemtsov is a case in point. The prominent opposition politician was shot dead in 2015, gunned down right in front of the Kremlin. 5 Chechens were convicted of the killing, but who gave the order? In the West, many blamed Putin himself. But in Russia, Nemtsov's supporters believe he was killed because of an internal battle within the security establishment, involving the FSB and the Chechen leader Ramzan Kadyrov. Even many of Boris Nemtsov's supporters and Vladimir Putin's harshest critics believe that the Russian president didn't know about the murder until after it happened. And interestingly, just a few days after the killing, Putin disappeared from public view for more than a week. The assumption was he was trying to restore order amongst the clans. Let's go back to our map of Kremlin influence. The elites can be further subdivided into 2 groups, the liberal reformists and those who favour stronger state control of the economy. The security services can also be divided into camps, the FSB and other rivals like the Interior Ministry and military and foreign intelligence. The Kremlin's factions are in flux. Conflicts are usually played out behind closed doors, but occasionally they break out into the open. Late last year, Alexei Ulyukayev, Putin's former economy minister, was sentenced to 8 years in a penal colony. The case hinged on a sting operation by the security services involving Igor Sechin, a close confidant of Putin, CEO of the Russian oil giant Rosneft, and one of the most powerful men in Russia. In a country where institutions are weak, the Kremlin's clans cluster around individuals. Igor Sechin is widely regarded as a leader of the Siloviki, or one of them, and also as an advocate of greater state control. The jailed economy minister belonged to the liberal reformists. His conviction was a victory for the statists.
The idea of Putin's power is that he himself controls only some sectors of power, of what he wants to be manageable. And of course, it's law enforcement structures, it's energy sector, foreign policy, military and industrial complex. That's it.
And so to Salisbury. If we assume that Russia was behind the attack on the Skripals in some form, that leaves 2 possibilities. Either Putin ordered or approved the operation, or he didn't. And if he didn't, then was it part of the ongoing battle for power between the clans?
there could be a scenario in which one of the security services that are fighting with another part of the security services are interested to see Russia moving more again into a more confrontational relationship with the West, and are using that incident in Salisbury to be able to influence the course of where Russian policy is going after the elections.
As Russia and the West come close to direct confrontation in Syria,
обстановка в мире становится все более хаотичной.
Dealing with a man who's willing to tear up the international rulebook to achieve his goals is one thing. Dealing with a man who might be losing control to powerful warring factions is quite another.
Gabriel Gatehouse there. Well, let's get a view of all of that and relations with Russia from someone who's been an insider there, former spy for the Soviets. Vladimir Yakunin got to know Mr. Putin before Mr. Putin was famous, and indeed rose to be the head of the Russian railways for 10 years. He's one of those named as having sanctions against him by the United States, not by the UK. He's currently the chairman of Dialogue of Civilizations Group, and he's published a memoir here, The Treacherous Path, with many of his adventures. A very good evening to you.
Thank you.
Just on the subject of Gabriel's piece, do you think President Putin is in strong control over everything that is happening in Russia, or do you think the competing factions maybe are...
Listen, there are two structures of the state, presidential republic and parliamentary republic. So Russia is presidential republic, where the head of the executive is president. So from this point of view, we should consider what's going on. Otherwise, you know, it is simplification to say that just one person can dictate and can control everything all over the world. That is not possibility.
That's not possible, right. Who do you think ordered the killing of Alexander Litvinenko?
Listen, I have no idea about that. And as we know, after all these researches, all of these investigations, the final answer was not given officially, by the way. You know, so I don't know, and I doubt...
I think you can almost take that one as a lie detector test. We know who killed Alexander Litvinenko. It was Andrei Lugovoy and Dmitry Kovtun. The British asked for them to be extradited. Instead, in fact, President Putin has given Mr. Lugovoy a medal for services to the motherland. How can we have a conversation, any dialogue? Your group is Dialogue of Civilizations. Yep. How can we have a dialogue when such a basic known fact, which was traced to the polonium trail left by Mr. Lugovoy all over London in the plane, how can we have the conversation if we can't get you to even address the most basic known issues?
Listen, first of all, both of us, we agree that until the court decision was delivered, there is no basic facts. That is only for the court to decide. But answering your question, I suppose from both sides, if we are talking about West and East, if we are talking Russia and Europe, if we are talking, you know, the big West and Russia, you know, I suppose this is a high time to try to calm down, to stop and to think.
Sure. I think a lot of people would love to. It's just that they can't get over the very basic gap in communications.
Correct. I agree with you. I agree with you.
Well, let's go on to the Skripals. What do you think happened to the Skripals? Do you accept the British government state, or do you go with one Victoria said, you know, that they had bad fish or something like that? What do you think happened to the Skripals?
Listen, the short version, again, I suppose we should deal only with the facts. The phrase is that it seemed to be, or there is a lot of, you know, evidence. This is not for the serious people. You know, in this field, the field of secret services, intelligence, there is a special code of behavior. Those, you know, detained agents which were, you know, exchanged with the others, you know, never are the subject for further prosecution.
Well, you know what? If Russia didn't do it, if I was a country and was falsely accused of doing it, I think I would take that quite seriously and say, look, no, I didn't do it. I had developed Novichok, but I've never used it for political assassination. Instead, we've had a lot of sneering, sarcastic tweets and jokes from the Russian embassy. We've had items on Russian state television making jokes about traitors dying in odd circumstances in the UK.
Listen, you just mentioned dialogue. You know, even if we are talking the same language, whether Russian, for one part it is not native, for example, or English, for another part it is not native. But, you know, the mentality is different. And I am positive, you know, Ambassador was not meaning to be sarcastic.
Oh,
he would like
he wasn't, believe me. No, believe me. Totally means to be sarcastic. His English is fantastic. That the embassy tweet.
Listen, I don't want to discuss him. You ask my opinion. My opinion is that, you know, we should done better that in terms of, you know, explanations. But on the other side, it was not directed to humiliate anybody.
We haven't got time to go through all of these. So let's focus on Syria. And you heard the two gentlemen we had on earlier saying we need deterrence and there mustn't be escalation. What's your reaction to what you heard them saying in terms of Syria?
Listen, I'm very much concerned, to tell the truth, because what Ambassador said, we will strike, but, you know, we do not expect that the situation will deteriorate. That is something naive. It is not possible. And if we are talking about Cold War, I suppose now the world is standing on the border of real hot war. And
you think Putin, if he sees retaliation against Syria, will feel that as he needs to retaliate against the retaliation?
Again, you know, we are living in the world of information fakes. I'm not saying that is exactly everywhere, but, you know, we are living in a strange world.
We are. We're living in a world where Russia says, oh, there hasn't been a chemical attack. By the way, they said there hadn't been a chemical attack last year. They voted again in the UN yesterday, vetoed the idea of an independent investigation. The independent investigation we had last year found there was a chemical attack. It was Assad, surprise, surprise.
Many hours, but there was Iraq. And there was an assumption that Hussein possessed the you know, military capabilities of the mass destruction.
The point is,
finally, there is nothing of the kind.
And no one is predicating the correctness of Western policy on this against the correctness of Western policy on that. The West, the UK, has had the most massive amount of investigation of the mistakes that were made in the run-up to the Iraq war. Has Russia said anything about last year's chemical attack in Syria, which independent investigations have now clearly found was Assad's air force?
If you ask for my opinion, if there is any proof of real attack, I will be the first to condemn this. I am condemning the attempt to assassinate people here, Skripal and his daughter, but I cannot buy everything which I am reading and seeing now, just because, you know, it was said, listen, experts said that it was Russian to produce, it was Russian made. But finally, experts, British experts said, no way, we cannot detect it. It is not possible. Why politicians were using that to address the society? I mean, it is not correct.
No one is saying that all sides don't make some mistakes, and that isn't. The question is, can you have a sensible conversation with Russia about any of these issues when they're throwing so much disinformation and fakery out? Look, it's in a way. Our picture of Russia is one of a sort of thuggish capitalism, of a kleptocracy where people, an elite, are taking the resources for themselves. To what extent, and this is, your book misses out all sorts of interesting things. It has your great accounts of your time running the railroad, but you were part of that establishment. You're part of that problem, aren't you? Reuters report on the contracts for the railways. Under your watch, they were finding tens of contracts given to companies that were shell companies. No one knew who owned them. There were only two bidders for the contracts. They were both companies turned out to look like they were linked to each other. Money going into them. Reuters were finding transactions passing through a bank that was run by an old acquaintance of yours, who you said understands banking well, and no railway services were being delivered. This is just gross corruption, ripping off the Russian people, and this is why we are where we are.
Listen, firstly, by my status, yes, I was part of the establishment. You are correct. All other things, those assumptions are not correct, because never, ever, you know, any checking found out that the money was paid in Russian railways, but the services were not delivered. Never. It is false assumption. This is not true. This is not correct. As far as the system, as far as the way to do business, whether I like it or not, you know, if there is a company which, in accordance with the law, Russian law, is getting, you know, the contract, they should fulfill it. Never, at my memory, we signed a contract and the service was not delivered. Never.
Can I ask, do you think Russian taxpayers and railway users got value for money out of contracts you awarded, or under your watch, that were awarded to shell companies? No one knows, there's no public ownership, and they appear to be linked companies with only 2 bidders. 43 contracts between, I mean, between a whole bunch of years, actually. I mean, you know, you can read
forget about it. Listen, never it was the case when the monies, railway monies, were paid and the service was not delivered.
Right, okay. Well,
this is
a very
first.
narrow question.
Yeah.
But we know you're a very wealthy man with a house that's 70 hectares outside Moscow.
May I finish? Second, we were the company which was given all the rights and orders to construct Olympic Games infrastructure. We made it 2 years before the mandatory period. We made unbelievable. And my partners, my friends from Western Railways, they praised this work. That was the answer whether the taxpayers were getting the service or not for the monies we were paid.
We see you're a very wealthy man. Your son is a very wealthy man. He's got British citizenship. He lives here. Do you understand why there is such Western suspicion? When we look at the Skripals, the attitude to chemical weapon attacks in Syria, do you understand why the West has so many suspicions of Putin's Russia?
Listen, yes, because I'm professionally dealing with the aspects of relations between different civilizations. You know, I can answer your question. It will take a lot of time, but to make it short, listen, the suspicions between nations, between West and East, was not born yesterday. It was not born even 10 years ago. That is the historical precedent we are living through. But now I'm positive the world developed to such a scale that we should consider what will be the future for our kids. And that is a very good reason to stop, whether you like it or not, to stop, to think, and to deal with the objective facts.
That's a good note to end it. Vladimir, thank you very much indeed. Vladimir Yakunin in the book, The Treacherous Path. Thanks.
So, Stephen Bush, Harriet Sargent here to talk more. And the Daily Express, one tweet from war, kind of sums it up, doesn't it?
Well, it's a very strange way of announcing a war. It's through a tweet. Very terrifying.
And it was a terrifying tweet too, wasn't it?
It was a terrifying tweet, yeah. I mean, these two men, I mean, Putin and Trump, it's just rather like, I've been watching a lot of boxing matches recently, and it's rather like two boxers trashing each other before they get into the ring. Of course, the really frightening thing is that Syria is such a small country, and you've got these major players in there who are tripping over each other. I mean, you've got in the north, you've got the Americans tripping over Turkey, over the Kurds, you've got the Russians, and then you've also got sort of Iran and Israel sort of exchanging insults. I mean, Iran has just said that Israel's killed some of its nationalities and it's going to go against Israel. So altogether, this is a very dangerous, dangerous situation.
And the most fascinating thing about it is it has brought the possibility of a direct engagement between the US and Russia. Trump tweeting today, Russia vows to shoot down any and all missiles fired at Syria. This was the Russian ambassador to Lebanon. Get ready, Russia, because they will be coming nice and new and smart. You shouldn't be partners with a gas-killing animal who kills his people and enjoys it. The threat, then, of that direct engagement takes us back to recollections for some people of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Are we really at that kind of stage?
Well, I think the big difference between the Cuban Missile Crisis is yes, once again, you have a country which is a proxy war for these much bigger forces. But crucially, although it's Trump sending these tweets, he's not responding to statements from Vladimir Putin. Of course, the scary thing about this confrontation is you have two leaders who feel they have a need to always look strong and not to lose face. But fortunately, Vladimir Putin has not yet himself been in a position where he has put his face on the line in the same way. Russia has occasionally in Syria, when there have been accidents which have led to Russian assets being shot down, kind of gone, OK, we can smooth that under the carpet, provided they feel that their warm water port in Syria is safe and within their sphere of influence. Seeing as it still feels likely that whatever plan the government comes up with will effectively be to chuck a missile at an airfield in order to make ourselves feel better or something, and then to move on, perhaps it's easier to see how this can de-escalate, whereas the scary thing about the Cuban Missile Crisis, both then and when you read up on it now, is just realising actually the margin for error was very, very slim, but who knows?
And well, sorry, I mean, there was this Russian general who was just talking just recently, just a few hours ago, saying that he thought actually it was worse now, relations. It was more dangerous than the Cuban Missile Crisis, and that it was more likely to escalate.
Absolutely. So onto the Daily Telegraph quotes this tweet, this extraordinary tweet. This is the new normal. We have to remember this isn't normally how diplomacy is carried out. Trump warns missiles are coming. Theresa May orders Navy submarines to move within missile range. We've not had independent confirmation of that, certainly. But if a British submarine, a Navy submarine, is moving within missile range, does that signify that, first of all, she will not be going to the Commons to get a vote there? Convening the War Cabinet tomorrow in Downing Street will likely signify that Britain is being included in this action.
She can't go to the Commons. She hasn't got time. She's got to be ready to move.
All the numbers.
So she really, so she really doesn't have time. She can't really say to Trump, hang on, can we just wait a few days, wait till Monday, and then I'll be able to be with you. She can't do that.
I don't know, I think she probably does have the numbers. There are at least 50 Labour MPs who very deeply regret their decision to vote against intervention in 2013, and many of them, rightly or wrongly, see this as an opportunity to fix that wrong. A lot of the Conservative isolationists are now implementing Brexit, of course. I doubt they're going to resign from their great project to vote against this. Of course, she has no constitutional need to seek a vote. However, one of the advantages of doing so is that it does slightly insulate yourself from any political blowback if things go wrong.
And the issue of precedent, right back to Tony Blair and all those UN resolutions before 2003, not to mention the 2013 vote, the Ed Miliband vote where it got thrown out. There is precedent, isn't there, to do that? But she can ignore that quite happily, can she?
Yeah, there's no constitutional, there's no legal binding. It's just a convention. I mean, David Cameron also went into Mali without a vote in 2013, and in Libya, the vote was basically, we've done this, now are you going to authorise it? And in the end, I think only about 8 MPs, including, of course, Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell, which slightly adds to the internal dynamic now. But there is no, the problem / the benefit, I guess, depending on your perspective, of our unwritten constitution is unless the executive is explicitly forbidden from doing something, and in this case it's not, the government can go to war without parliamentary approval if it wants to.
And the question is, should the UK go to war on this?
I don't think so. I think absolutely not. I don't know why we're getting involved with this. I think it's been a disaster. Every time we've gone into a Middle Eastern country, it's been a complete disaster.
But the red line is the use of chemical weapons on civilians.
But why is it that all weapons are horrendous? I mean, chemical weapons are awful, and those pictures of those poor children are just simply heartbreaking. But I don't quite understand why we have this sort of thing about one kind of weapon is worse from another kind of weapon. I mean, some of the weapons we use, blowing people to bits.
Because it's a weapon of mass destruction. By the very title, it gives you a clue that it's
sending in
unacceptable.
missiles and blowing people to bits is also is also horrendous. So I just don't quite understand the kind of particular aversion to this one kind of weapon.
Stephen?
Well, I think that just because horrific weapons are used doesn't mean that we shouldn't seek to try and reduce the level of horrors. We have successfully curbed the use of landmines in many parts of the world, but sadly not all. However, I think there are two separate issues here. One is, do France, the US and the UK have an alternate to Assad in the region that they want? No, they don't. Therefore, it does feel a bit like having this thing with Assad where he uses chemical weapons, we chuck a missile at an airfield, we briefly feel better about ourselves, then in 2 weeks' time he gasses some more people. It doesn't feel like it has a lot of point. Then I think there's the separate question of should we go to war without a parliamentary vote? Yes, as I've said, we can. However, I don't think we should have that power. I think that's an element of our legal system which should be changed. My suspicion is if there is a Labour government after the next election, you can bet that the need for a government to have a parliamentary vote before going to war will be codified pretty damn quickly.
And you don't think there's any relation between the international support Theresa May got on the Salisbury nerve agent attack and the need to also draw a red line about the use of chemical weapons elsewhere?
I think that's the problem. I mean, that's the corner she's in. Because she has had backing, she has had terrific backing, international backing, and so suddenly, rather more quickly than she thought, she's been called to give something back, to say thank you, to return the favour, and this is her problem. And she's been. I read in one of the papers that people are now thinking that maybe Putin's actually orchestrated this whole thing, that this is a very clever trap that he has laid for the West to walk in. And it sort of feels like that. We sort of feel that we're being pushed into this terrible position without having any exit.
And the UK government's assessment of what happened in Salisbury will also be tested tomorrow. Of course, the International Chemical Weapons Watchdog has announced that it's handing over its report on the Salisbury nerve agent attack to the UK government after completing its investigation. That will test the credibility of what Theresa May said to all those world leaders around the world that then supported her. It'll be interesting to see. You picked up on the Mac cartoon as well, I think, didn't you? Which says, this missile is so smart it finds President Trump's tweets painfully embarrassing. Do you think the world should be embarrassed by his tweets today?
I think, in general, the world should find it embarrassing and slightly scary that we appear to have, as the leader of the most powerful democracy in the world, someone who seems to have the impulse control of a toddler, who often, I think it was the Washington Post did an excellent thing, tracking his tweets and the things he was getting angry with was what happened to be on Fox News at the time. I mean, when I have a day off or I'm feeling sick, I react weirdly on Twitter to what happens to be flicking by on daytime television, but my weird tweets can't trigger a stock market sell-off or a world war. So I think it is embarrassing and terrifying in equal measure.
Well, we will watch with interest what happens in the next few days, then, won't we? Certainly.